No Maid survived a day with the Billionaire'S Triplets until the black woman came and did this. The marble floors of the Whitmore estate gleam like mirrors reflecting the chaos of another failed day. Broken vases and scattered toys marking the battlefield where tech billionaire Alexander Whitmore's 8-year-old triplets have claimed another victim in their war against authority. In his penthouse office, Alexander reviews resignation letters from the 14th nanny this month, each document telling the same story. Mason, Madison, and Maxwell are brilliant, beautiful, and absolutely uncontrollable, their behavior deteriorating since their mother's death 2 years ago in a systematic destruction that no amount of money or expertise has been able to address. Tomorrow, 55-year-old Nia Thompson will walk through doors that revolve with defeated caregivers. Her 30 years of experience working with challenging children hidden behind assumptions that domestic workers from her background couldn't possibly possess the wisdom to reach children that Ivy League child psychologists and celebrity behavior specialists have abandoned as unreachable. What happens next will challenge everything Alexander believes about parenting, potential, and the power of understanding that comes not from textbooks, but from a lifetime of turning brokenness into healing through love that refuses to surrender when others retreat. Alexander's morning routine unfolds in the sterile precision of a man who has learned to control every variable except the ones that matter most. His children's grief, his own inadequacy as a single father, and the growing recognition that wealth cannot purchase the emotional intelligence that effective parenting demands when trauma transforms children into adversaries rather than allies in the shared work of healing and growth. The estate operates like a military compound where staff move with fearful efficiency, their experience teaching them to complete tasks quickly while avoiding the triplets' attention that inevitably leads to confrontations ending in tears, broken furniture, and resignation letters that stack like evidence of his failure as both father and leader of household that money maintains but love struggles to inhabit. The children's wing of the mansion has been redesigned multiple times to accommodate behavior that defies every expert recommendation Alexander's wealth has purchased. Reinforced furniture that cannot be thrown, walls painted with washable surfaces that can survive artistic expressions of rage, floors cleared of anything breakable that might become projectile in hands of children whose intelligence manifests through destruction rather than creation when grief finds no healthy outlet for processing loss that their young minds cannot fully comprehend. Each modification represents surrender to chaos rather than solution to problems that seem to grow more complex despite expensive interventions that treat symptoms, while ignoring causes that textbook approaches fail to address. When theory meets reality of children whose trauma transcends academic understanding. Mason, the self-appointed leader despite being born only minutes before his siblings, demonstrates strategic thinking that would impress military tacticians if applied to purposes other than coordinating psychological warfare against adults whose authority he systematically undermines through carefully planned campaigns designed to expose weakness while maintaining plausible deniability that prevents decisive consequences. His intelligence manifests through elaborate schemes that reveal sophisticated understanding of human psychology, organizational dynamics, and illegal limitations that prevent meaningful discipline when children understand that their privileged status provides immunity from consequences that normal behavioral expectations would require. Madison, brilliant and manipulative with emotional intelligence that rivals trained negotiators, specializes in identifying psychological vulnerabilities that allow her to manipulate adults through strategic displays of innocence, victimhood, and heartbreaking grief that disarms authority figures while creating opportunities for her brothers to execute plans that her social awareness enables through reading people with accuracy that unnerves adults whose professional training hasn't prepared them for children whose trauma has accelerated emotional development while twisting it toward destructive rather than constructive purposes. Her tears can arrive and disappear with theatrical precision that suggests either genuine emotional disturbance or calculated manipulation that her age makes impossible to definitively categorize. Maxwell, the youngest by mere minutes, but possessing mechanical aptitude that threatens household infrastructure, has learned to disable security systems, reprogram electronic devices, and modify household equipment in ways that create chaos while demonstrating intellectual capabilities that engineering schools would celebrate if applied to problems other than making adult supervision impossible through technical sabotage that his siblings coordinate with social and psychological attacks. Designed to overwhelm caregivers whose training focused on normal behavioral challenges rather than systematic psychological warfare, waged by grieving children whose intelligence makes them formidable opponents when trust has been replaced by determination to drive away anyone who might represent another loss to hearts that cannot risk additional abandonment. The pattern repeats with clockwork precision as each new caregiver arrives with confidence that their advanced degrees, specialized training, or celebrity reputation will succeed where others have failed, only to discover that the triplets possess strategic thinking that transcends their 8 years, while their coordinated resistance reveals planning that would impress corporate consultants if applied to legitimate business challenges rather than systematic destruction of authority through methods that exploit every weakness in approaches that assume children want guidance rather than control, healing rather than power, connection rather than continued isolation that protects them from additional losses that their traumatized minds interpret as inevitable betrayals disguised as care. Nia Thompson steps off the city bus at the estate's imposing gates, her worn but dignified clothing marking her as different from the stream of expensive specialists who arrive in luxury cars with credentials that impress Alexander more than they intimidate children whose experience has taught them that education doesn't equal understanding, that expertise doesn't guarantee wisdom, that professional reputation provides no protection against determined resistance from minds that have learned to weaponize their own pain while refusing comfort that might leave them vulnerable to additional loss when trust becomes dangerous rather than healing. Her resume lacks the prestigious degrees and celebrity endorsements that previous candidates carried like armor into battles they inevitably lost, but her 30 years of experience includes children that others had abandoned, foster kids aged out of systems, siblings separated by tragedy, adolescents whose trauma manifested through violence that trained professionals couldn't address through approaches that prioritize control over connection, compliance over healing, behavioral modification, over genuine relationship building that requires patience, persistence, and understanding that textbooks teach, but experience refines into wisdom that cannot be purchased or credentialed, only earned through commitment that survives repeated failure while maintaining faith that breakthrough remains possible. Alexander's interview reveals his desperation disguised as professional evaluation, his questions focusing on credentials and methodology rather than character and commitment that effective childcare demands when working with children whose intelligence makes them immune to manipulation but responsive to authenticity that they can detect with accuracy that unnerves adults whose professional training emphasize techniques over relationships, strategies over genuine care, behavioral outcomes, over emotional healing that trauma requires when recovery becomes possible through connection that children choose rather than submit to when given alternatives that their experience has taught them to evaluate carefully before risking trust. Mrs. Thompson, Alexander begins, his voice carrying skepticism born from repeated failure rather than accurate assessment of capabilities that her background represents. My children have defeated specialists with PhDs in child psychology, behavioral modification experts with international reputations, and celebrity nannies whose methods work with normal children. What makes you think you can succeed where they've failed? His question reveals assumptions about competence that correlate credentials with capability rather than recognizing that wisdom often develops through experience rather than education, that understanding sometimes emerges from struggle rather than study, that effectiveness may require approaches that academic training doesn't teach when dealing with children whose trauma transcends typical behavioral challenges. Nia's response demonstrates understanding that comes from decades of working with children that systems had abandoned, whose behavioral challenges reflected pain rather than pathology, whose resistance represented protection rather than defiance, when viewed through lens of trauma-informed care that prioritizes healing over compliance. Mr. Whitmore, those children aren't trying to defeat anyone. They're trying to protect themselves from being hurt again. When you understand that their behavior comes from grief rather than badness, from fear rather than defiance, you approach them differently. You don't try to control them. You try to understand them. You don't try to break their will. You try to heal their hearts. Her words create a moment of recognition in Alexander's understanding as he processes possibility that his children's behavior represents a logical response to circumstances rather than inexplicable pathology, that their resistance might protect wounded hearts rather than demonstrate inherent defiance. That healing might require different approaches than control, when trauma transforms children into adversaries who need allies rather than authorities, understanding rather than ultimatums, patience. Rather than pressure when recovery demands time that money cannot purchase and techniques that credentials cannot guarantee, when effectiveness depends on relationships that children choose rather than endure when given authentic alternatives to approaches that have failed because they address symptoms while ignoring causes that only love can heal. Naya's first encounter with the triplets happens within minutes of Alexander's departure from meetings that corporate demands require, but paternal instincts resist, leaving her alone with children whose reputation for destroying caregivers through coordinated psychological warfare has created legend among domestic staffing agencies that warn potential candidates about assignment that career counselors recommend avoiding if professional survival matters more than personal mission to reach. Children that others consider unreachable through conventional methods that focus on behavioral control rather than emotional healing, when trauma requires approaches that textbooks describe, but experience must adapt to individual circumstances. Mason approaches first, his leadership instincts recognizing new challenge that requires assessment before coordinating response with siblings whose specialized capabilities complement his strategic thinking through division of labor that maximizes effectiveness while minimizing individual exposure to consequences that their privileged status normally prevents, but that new authority figures might attempt to impose if their resistance proves insufficient to maintain autonomy that protects them from additional losses that trust might enable when adults prove unreliable through abandonment that their experience has taught them to anticipate rather than risk preventing through hope. You won't last until dinner. Mason announces with confidence born from repeated victory over adults whose professional training proved inadequate against children whose trauma had accelerated intellectual development, while channeling it toward destructive rather than constructive purposes when survival demanded weaponizing intelligence that could have served learning if circumstances had provided safety rather than loss, stability rather than chaos, healing rather than continued wounding that. Each failed caregiver represented through departures that confirmed their worst fears about abandonment and betrayal disguised as care. Naya's response surprises him through its complete lack of defensiveness, challenge, or attempt to establish authority through dominance that previous caregivers had attempted with predictable failure. You might be right, Mason. I worked with lots of children who didn't want me around at first. That's okay. I'm not here to make you want me. I'm here because your father loves you and wants you to be happy, even though I can see that happiness feels dangerous right now, because it might mean trusting someone who could leave like your mama did. The directness of her acknowledgement creates a moment of shocked silence, as Mason processes adult who names truth rather than avoiding uncomfortable reality, who recognizes his pain rather than dismissing his behavior, who offers understanding rather than demanding compliance, when his experience has taught him that adults either patronize children through false cheerfulness or attempt to control them through threats that their privileged status makes meaningless when consequences cannot match the determination that grief provides when protecting wounded hearts from additional damage that trust might enable if hope proves misplaced. Madison materializes with theatrical precision designed to test new caregivers' reaction to emotional manipulation that has proven effective against adults whose professional training emphasized behavioral responses rather than recognition of underlying pain that drives surface behavior, when trauma transforms normal developmental patterns into survival strategies that prioritize protection over connection. Safety over growth, control over healing when children learned that vulnerability leads to loss rather than love, when adult reliability cannot be assumed despite promises that experience has taught them to evaluate skeptically. Her tears arrive with perfect timing designed to create sympathy that previous caregivers had attempted to address through comfort that provided opportunities for Maxwell's technical sabotage, while Mason coordinated escape routes that allowed retreat before consequences could accumulate into meaningful discipline that their coordinated resistance normally prevented through overwhelming adult capacity for supervision and control, when three brilliant children working together could outmaneuver individual caregivers whose training focused on normal behavioral challenges rather than systematic psychological warfare that grief had taught them to wage against authority figures who represented potential additional losses. But Naya responds with recognition rather than reaction, understanding rather than manipulation, when Madison's performance meets adult who sees through tears to trauma, who recognizes pain rather than dismissing behavior, who offers presence rather than solutions when healing requires witness rather than intervention. Madison, those are real tears even though you're using them to test me. Your heart hurts so much that you've learned to use your pain as protection. That must be exhausting, sweetheart, carrying all that sadness while trying to take care of your brothers and yourself. Her words penetrate defenses that tactical tears were designed to maintain, creating vulnerability that Madison hadn't anticipated when authenticity meets manipulation with compassion rather than correction. Maxwell's attempt at technical sabotage reveals itself when lights flicker and security alarms begin their familiar symphony of chaos designed to overwhelm adult supervision while creating opportunities for coordinated mischief that normally sends caregivers into frantic attempts to restore order, while children execute additional phases of plans designed to demonstrate futility of attempting control over environment that they can manipulate through superior knowledge of systems that wealth has installed, but children have learned to master through necessity that survival demanded, when autonomy became protection against additional losses that adult authority might represent. Instead of panic or frustration that technical chaos typically creates in caregivers whose training emphasized maintaining order through environmental control, Naya responds with genuine curiosity about capabilities that Maxwell's sabotage reveals. Maxwell, that's incredible engineering for someone your age. You must understand electrical systems better than most adults. I bet you could design amazing things if you wanted to build instead of just taking apart. Her recognition of his intelligence separate from his behavior creates a moment of unexpected pride that technical abilities deserve celebration rather than correction when channeled toward construction rather than destruction. The shift in dynamic becomes apparent as Naya moves through mansion, not attempting to prevent or punish disruption, but engaging with children's actual interests and capabilities that their destructive behavior simultaneously demonstrates, and waste when intelligence serves protection rather than exploration, learning, or creation that trauma has made secondary to survival needs, that grief has twisted toward isolation rather than connection, when trust becomes dangerous rather than healing, through relationships that might provide additional opportunities for loss. You know what I think? Naya says as she examines Maxwell's technical modifications with professional interest rather than disapproval. I think you three are the smartest, most creative children I've ever met. You've just been using your intelligence to protect yourselves instead of exploring what you could create together if you felt safe enough to risk caring about something other than keeping people away. Her observation reframes their behavior from pathology to logic, from defiance to protection, from problems to potential that circumstances have channeled destructively, but that different environment might redirect toward purposes that serve growth rather than just survival. The triplets exchange glances that communicate volumes about recognition they hadn't expected from adult who sees capabilities rather than just challenges, who understands protection rather than just problems, who offers relationship rather than just requirements when their experience has taught them that adults either attempt control through dominance or abandon responsibility through defeat rather than providing consistency that healing requires when trauma transforms children into adversaries who need allies rather than authorities, understanding rather than ultimatums. Mason's strategic thinking begins calculating possibilities that different approach might create. Madison's emotional intelligence recognizes authenticity that previous caregivers hadn't demonstrated. And Maxwell's technical mind processes implications of having capabilities recognized rather than just restrained when adults focus on potential rather than just problems that current behavior represents through choices that protection demanded, but that safety might allow changing if trust becomes possible rather than dangerous when relationships provide healing rather than additional opportunities for loss. The transformation begins gradually as Naya demonstrates consistency that their testing cannot break, patience that their resistance cannot exhaust, and understanding that their pain cannot drive away. When commitment survives repeated challenge while maintaining faith that connection remains possible despite evidence that their experience has taught them to expect abandonment rather than persistence, when adults face difficulties that love must overcome if healing is to become possible through relationships that children choose rather than endure. 3 months later, the mansion that once echoed with chaos now resonates with different sounds. Laughter that replaces screaming, collaboration that replaces destruction, and conversations that replace the tense silence of people walking on emotional landmines. Mason has channeled his strategic intelligence toward organizing charity events that help children in foster care. His leadership skills finally serving purposes that build rather than destroy, that connect rather than isolate, that heal rather than wound, when intelligence finds constructive outlet through service that makes sense of loss by preventing others from experiencing similar abandonment. Madison's emotional intelligence now serves as bridge between her family and broader community as she helps other grieving children process loss through art therapy programs that her own healing has inspired. Her tears becoming tools for empathy rather than manipulation, when understanding serves connection rather than control, when vulnerability becomes strength rather than weakness that must be protected through isolation that grief had demanded until safety made openness possible rather than dangerous. Maxwell's technical abilities have found expression through robotics projects that help disabled children access education and recreation that physical limitations might otherwise prevent, his modifications now serving construction rather than destruction, building rather than breaking, creating rather than dismantling, when intelligence serves love rather than protection, hope rather than fear, possibility rather than just survival that trauma had required until healing made growth achievable. Through relationships that support rather than threaten development. Alexander watches his children's transformation with amazement that extends beyond gratitude into recognition that Naya's approach succeeded where expensive expertise failed because wisdom understands what credentials cannot teach. That children need connection more than correction, understanding more than ultimatums, patience more than pressure when trauma transforms normal developmental needs into survival requirements that love must meet before growth becomes possible through relationships. That children choose rather than endure when given authentic alternatives to abandonment. The changes extend beyond immediate family as Naya's influence creates ripple effects throughout household staff who observe different approaches to authority and relationship, discipline and healing, control and connection, when leadership serves rather than dominates, when power enables rather than oppresses, when wisdom guides rather than just rules through fear that isolation requires, but that safety allows replacing with cooperation, when trust becomes possible rather than dangerous through consistency that proves reliability over time. Naya's success with the triplets becomes case study that child development professionals analyze not because her methods were revolutionary, but because her understanding was authentic. She recognized that challenging behavior often reflects pain rather than pathology, that resistance frequently protects wounded hearts rather than demonstrates defiance, that healing requires relationship rather than just technique, when trauma transforms children's needs in ways that love must address before conventional approaches become effective through connections that children trust rather than fear. As evening routines unfold with peaceful cooperation that once seemed impossible, the triplets gather around Naya for stories that process their grief while building hope, their healing evident in willingness to risk caring about tomorrow rather than just surviving today, to invest in relationships rather than just protecting against loss, to embrace possibility rather than just enduring pain when love proves reliable enough to justify hope that abandonment is not inevitable despite experience, that had taught them to expect betrayal rather than trust persistence when commitment survives testing. The woman whose background suggested she couldn't possibly succeed where experts had failed proved that wisdom doesn't announce itself through credentials, that understanding comes from experience rather than just education, that effectiveness requires heart more than technique when working with children whose trauma transcends academic understanding but responds to authentic care that recognizes pain without being overwhelmed by it, that offers presence without demanding compliance, that provides consistency without requiring perfection when healing becomes possible through relationships that serve rather than exploit vulnerability, that trust must risk if growth is to replace mere survival as the goal, that defines success in work that transforms lives rather than just managing behavior, when love finds courage to persist despite repeated testing that wounded hearts require before risking hope that connection might heal rather than harm. If this story moved you, maybe it's time to look beyond surface behavior to underlying pain, to recognize that challenging children often need understanding more than correction, that wisdom sometimes comes from unexpected places, and that healing requires relationship more than technique when working with hearts that have learned to protect themselves through behavior that pushes away the very connection they desperately need. If it is choose connection over control, understanding over ultimatums, patience over pressure, when love becomes the bridge that trauma requires for crossing from survival to healing.